The fact is that a very teeny tiny percentage of designers are actually making decent money selling patterns. Hello, fiber friends, and welcome back to the Made You Better One and Its YouTube channel. Today, we're going to be talking about the price of knitting patterns. I am firmly in the camp that knitting patterns are not overpriced. So in order to make my argument today, I am going to look at two things. One is the way that knitting patterns have evolved over the last 100-ish years. And two, how long it actually takes to design a knitting pattern. So if that sounds like something that will be of interest to you, I hope you will stick around. All right, hello again, friends. As I said, today we're talking about the price of knitting patterns. So this is a topic that comes up from time to time. And was inspired I've been seeing it brought up in comments on some of my videos and Instagram reels lately. There's always somebody who wants to chime in and start arguing that knitting patterns have gotten too expensive. Everyone's entitled to their opinion. So today I'm going to share my opinion, which is that that is just not the case. But I understand that sometimes we misconstrue, I can't afford this with it's too expensive. Sometimes we don't really understand the amount of work that goes into something, and so we perceive it as being too expensive. There are a lot of factors at play. So what I want to focus on today is just talking about how comprehensive, detailed knitting patterns have become, especially as compared to where they were about 100 years ago, give or take a couple of decades. Just the dramatic shift from kind of a vague guideline to a detailed step-by-step multimedia sometimes set of instructions. And then I want to talk a little bit about an experiment I did about 5 years ago where I kept track of how long it took me to design and publish a sweater pattern. So let's start with the first point, which is about how knitting patterns have changed dramatically. Even just over the last 20 years since I started knitting, they have changed dramatically. But if we go back to about 100 years ago, early 20th century, this is a time where knitting patterns were primarily either something you got when you bought yarn, usually for free, or they were found in magazines like Godey's Ladies Magazine. That was pretty much it. There were some pamphlets sometimes that you could get, especially when we were doing the war knitting. There were some books dedicated to knitting and knitting patterns, but there were far, far fewer sources of knitting patterns than there are today. Independent designers were not really a thing. Knitting patterns, as I said, were produced by either a magazine or a yarn company, which would shoulder all of the costs that were involved in producing that knitting pattern. And when I say knitting pattern, I mean something very different than what we really think of as a knitting pattern today. So overall, I'm just going to kind of give you an overall view of what a knitting pattern consisted of in the 1920s and 30s. And then I'm going to show you a couple of examples. Overall, knitting patterns were a lot simpler because it assumed that the knitter already knew a lot of stuff and didn't have to have their hand held and have every detail explained. So it would have instructions like knit the right front like the left front, but reverse the shaping. That was it. Often they only had one size. And the size, it's completely divorced from anything that looks like a size to us today. It's just so different. The techniques used were not as advanced. So overall, circular knitting needles were a thing, but most garments tended to be knit in pieces and seamed. There was a lot more sewing. Most of the shaping was either increasing, decreasing, or binding off. So no short rows. Button bands were very simple, not these very nice double knit button bands that we see today. Not a lot of fancy cast-ons and bind-offs being used. It just says bind-off. So overall, just the techniques used were a lot simpler. The patterns had maybe a photo and it was in black and white. You had no way to see what it looked like on different sizes. Of course, wasn't written for different sizes, so but they were not giving you, 12 different photos of whatever it was modeled in different positions. You got one photo, maybe two. That was it on one person, one size body. So overall, just a much simpler pattern overall. Not a lot of bells and whistles. So I want to show you a couple vintage patterns. These are available online for free. And I'm going to do the screen recording so you can see what I'm looking at here. So these are I'm going to show you two. These are both from Free Vintage Knitting. I just kind of shift a little bit so I have room here to show you. All right, so this one is the Sugar Plum Cardigan pattern. It was originally published in 1939 by the Red Heart Company. So I picked this because this is kind of like the basic style of pattern that has become more popular today. A very straightforward, not a lot of fancy stuff going on in this pattern. This is the entire pattern. That's it. I can fit the entire pattern for this sweater on my screen. It comes in one size, 16. What does 16 mean? Not a clue. They do give you some measurements after blocking. There's no schematic though. It tells you exactly the yarn to use, but it doesn't say what the weight of the yarn is. I did look it up. This is a light fingering weight yarn. The measurements that they do give you, there's a fair number of measurements here, but some key things that we would usually see today are missing. So for example, the yoke depth, that is not included here. The back neck width, we don't see that here either. Those are just kind of some measurements that we're used to seeing today. You do have the gauge. It doesn't specify whether the gauge is before or after blocking. And as we scroll down, you can see some of the things that I just mentioned. So you can see where it says right front, work to correspond with left front reversing shapings. That's the entire instructions for a whole side of the sweater. When you look at the back instructions, work 6 inches of ribbing, decreasing 30 stitches on the last row. No instructions about how to go about decreasing those 30 stitches. Not a rate of decrease, not a style of decrease to use, nothing. Sleeves are knit separately. Then it says, sew up sleeve seams, sew in sleeves, matching sleeve shapings to armhole shapings, and gathering extra sleeve fullness into remaining armhole space. That's the entirety of the instructions for sewing in these set-in sleeves. So, of course, because there's only one size, you would expect that there would be fewer instructions, but even the instructions that are here are very general. You are not getting a whole lot of hand holding here. That's the entire pattern. The entire pattern fits on my screen for this sweater in one size. The next one I want to show you does have some sizes, 4 whole ones. This is the Best Beloved cardigan pattern. I believe this one was published about 10 years later. Let me double check. No, only a few years later, 1942. So now we're into the 40s. So as I said, this one comes in 4 sizes. It is also worked in the Red Heart Shetland floss. It's telling you how many balls you need for each size. But again, it's not telling you any kind of yardage or yarn weight. So substituting really is not going to be easy here if you don't have access to whatever this yarn is. Although probably the only way you're getting the pattern is to go buy this yarn. So I guess there's that. So what's interesting here is that, as I said, there are sizes, but it's all just kind of written in a table. You have to scroll across to find your size. So the sizes are 16, 18, 38, 40. I don't know. So it encompasses all the way from a 36-inch bust to a 42-inch bust. That's it. So, okay, we've got sizes, but you do have the full list of measurements, so that's helpful. And you have some gauge information. So I have come across a few. I went through a few of the patterns on the free vintage knitting, and not all of them have gauge information. So as you can see, this one is just a little bit more, it has some sizes. It is explaining how to mirror your armhole decreases, but it is still very sparse. I would also note that the front band is worked separately and has to be sewn on. That sounds terrible. Block pieces to measurements, sew all of your seams. Everything has to be sewn. Again, right front work correspond with left front, reversing shaping. So we're getting a little bit more information, not a ton. We're getting a little bit more detail in this one, but still very, very sparse compared to today. Knitting patterns today. Yarn companies still produce knitting patterns. Knitting magazines, there are a few left. Not a lot. Knitting patterns are no longer in sort of traditional ladies magazines, which also barely exist, but there are books. You can go to the library sometimes. You can obviously purchase the books, but overwhelmingly, knitting patterns have shifted to coming from independent designers. And what that means is, as opposed to a yarn company or a magazine absorbing most of the cost of the production of the pattern, most of the cost is falling directly on the designer. And there are a fair number of costs involved, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But more importantly, knitting patterns have become so much more comprehensive. First of all, and talking particularly about garment patterns, it is standard now to have 10 sizes or more in your pattern. That's a lot of grading. And contrary to popular belief, it's not just taking your Excel numbers in column A and stretching them out to column F. As sizes get larger, there is more nuance involved in the numbers and the sizing. So it gets more complicated the more sizes you add. Everything is spelled out. There's no decrease 30 stitches. In some European patterns, I have seen that, but overall, they're going to tell you exactly how to decrease the stitches and exactly what decrease stitches to use. There's no knit the right front like the left front, but reverse it. They're going to spell absolutely everything out for you. There are so many photos. You're going to get photos from every angle. If there's testing involved, you might get to see photos on different body shapes and sizes. They're color photos. You're going to get a schematic. It's going to show you all of the measurements that you need, hopefully. There are a lot more advanced techniques. The short rows, the different kinds of short rows, those beautiful double knit button bands, the tubular cast on, the Italian bind off. So many more advanced techniques that are making garments look less homemade and more handmade. And probably the biggest thing is the video tutorials. So even when I started knitting in 2007, that wasn't really a thing. There were some out there, but they weren't produced by the pattern designer and linked directly in their pattern, which overwhelmingly has become the trend now. And even more, and I've seen this more in crochet, there will be designers producing an entire video of them working XYZ thing from start to finish so that you can see every step of the way. This is a huge change from the free little pamphlet you got when you bought your yarn in 1940. And it's a lot of work. We just saw that sugar plum cardigan, I think it was called, that could fit the entire pattern on my iPad screen. This is the pattern for the Calm Down cardigan. You can see this is a pretty basic, straightforward cardigan that I am working on. This is a pattern by Lily Kate France. Yes, Lily Kate France. This is 13 pages. Okay. she is telling you, you've got um, the sample yarn, how much she used of that. You've got the approximate yardage and meterage if you're going to yarn substitute. You've got the gauge, all the notions, the needles. You have got a full schematic with measurements for inches and centimeters for the bust, the armhole depth, total length, upper sleeve, cuff, and sleeve length. All of that. You've got a detailed description of the construction, guidance for your yarn choice if you're yarn substituting. You have an email address where you can email her if you have a question. There is no way in hell you had anything like that in 1940. You got your pamphlet. Maybe you could go back to the yarn shop, which was probably not like a yarn shop, but was yarn was sold in like department stores and stuff then. Maybe you went there and asked if somebody, but that was it. And then you have all the abbreviations and techniques written out. All of the video tutorials are linked here. And then you have pages and pages of instructions, including how to pick up along a button band. You've got a little illustration here showing where you're picking up. There is so much information in here. This designer has tried to write a pattern that absolutely everybody can knit with every detail they could want, and still is giving you her email address in case something is unclear. This pattern retails for $10, and I'm going to tell you it's worth every penny. And I know that not everybody is going to agree with me. But the dramatic difference in the amount of information that it is included in that pattern, I think justifies that price. But there's more. Why do I think, yes, the pattern is dramatically more detailed, but does that inherently mean it's worth whatever the knitting pattern designer says? That's a question for each individual to decide. But in order to support my premise further, I'm going to talk about an experiment I did about 5 years ago. So for people who do not know, up until about 2021, knitting pattern design was my job, in that I was at home with young kids who were not in school full day, and it was something that I could do to bring in a little extra money. I was never a very popular designer. I never made very much money, but that was my primary way of generating income for, let's say, about 5 years. It was a little bit more than that. From about 2015 to about 2020. I published over 100 knitting patterns. In 2019, I decided to do a little experiment to see actually how long it took me to develop a knitting pattern. And a lot of the information I am going to be talking about in this next part of the video, I published in a series of blog posts back when people read blogs, and they are still, you cannot find them directly on my website, but they're still there. So I will provide links directly to them so you can see all the nitty-gritty details. So what I did was to basically time myself producing the pattern for the sound side pullover. This is a very basic pullover. It is a bottom-up drop shoulder. So minimal shaping, no setting in sleeves, mostly knit in the round because it is a pullover. So this was a very uncomplicated pattern. It took me about 45 hours to produce this pattern. What did that include? That includes, most of the time, is knitting the sample, grading, pattern writing, doing revisions when I got them back from my tech editor, photography, photo editing, pattern layout, and then all of the sort of publishing and initial marketing stuff that was done for the pattern. So about 45 hours for a very basic pattern. So what that it did not include at that time, we hadn't seen, or we were just starting to see this big push towards size inclusivity. So 6 standards was pretty, no, so 6 sizes was pretty standard for knitting patterns, and that is what it was originally graded to. It has been upgraded since. It now includes 9 sizes, but at the time it only included 6 sizes. There were no video tutorials. I did fully explain, all the abbreviations and techniques, but I was not recording tutorials specifically to go with patterns. And it didn't include, obviously, any follow-up pattern support stuff, which comes after the publication. So 45 hours to produce one pattern. Let's say I were trying to make myself $15 an hour. I would need to earn $675 from that pattern. Except there are expenses that go along with producing a pattern. Now, these are going to vary depending on the designer, but they're going to include tech editing. They may include yarn, depends on whether or not you got yarn support. They include the cost for the various softwares you need to use to make charts, to do your pattern layout, to do your photo editing, and all of the fees. So Ravelry takes a fee, Payhip takes a fee, PayPal takes a fee, whatever. So you've got fees coming from both the place that you're hosting and the transaction sponsor, which is PayPal, almost across the board. So if I wanted to make $675, which again is just $15 an hour, if I were only selling the pattern for $5, I'd have to sell 175 of it. Obviously, if I'm selling it for $10, which is its current retail price, I have to sell half that many to make that wage. Again, not covering any of the expenses that are involved. And I get into that into the blog post if you want to read it. So maybe that doesn't sound like a lot, but I have sold 40 copies of that pattern. That's it. Nowhere near what I would have to sell in order to earn $15 an hour, which is generally the wage you can find around here for, working at Target or whatever. It's not the living wage for where I live. But it is above the official minimum wage in Maryland, although it is slowly moving up to $15 an hour. So yeah, I sold, I think, 41 copies of that pattern because I was never a very popular designer. But the truth is, almost no one is. So that same year, 2019, Cassidy published, and I could not find it since. So I don't think she is still publishing it, or I just don't know where to look. But I did put a good effort into seeing if she is still doing this. She published the sales data from January sales on Ravelry. And what she said was that January is at least at the time in 2019, was the best-selling month, the month in which the most patterns were sold on Ravelry. And the result was that 90% of the people who had patterns for sale on Ravelry sold less than $200 worth of patterns that month. Again, this data is about 5 years old. The numbers, I'm sure, have changed, but I don't see any indication that the general trend is likely to have changed, which is that the vast, overwhelming majority of designers selling patterns on Ravelry are not making very much money. 3% of designers sold over $1,000 that month. That's only $12,000 a year. 1.6 sold over $2,000. That's still only $24,000 a year. Now, this is complicated by the fact that a lot of designers have other sources of income, they sell on other sites, et cetera, et cetera. But the fact is that a very teeny tiny percentage of designers are actually making decent money selling patterns. Most designers are not selling hundreds and hundreds of every pattern that they produce. People like to argue that, oh, if you just lower your prices, you will sell more patterns. It simply isn't true. You just won't. The vast majority of pattern sales are going to a handful of the most popular designers. What is true is that that handful of designers could probably afford to lower their individual pattern prices and still make a good living because of the sheer volume of patterns that they sell. But they're the outliers. And it's hard to see that because they're the ones that are the most popular. They're the ones you see everywhere. They're actually the exception to the rule. I think that when people see a price tag that says $10 or $12 for a pattern, yes, it does look high. But when you factor in the amount of work that goes into producing even a very simple pattern and the actual sales volume for 95% of pattern designers, it makes good sense. Now, that doesn't mean you can afford it. There's lots of things in life I can't afford. And that sucks, but that doesn't mean that it's overpriced. So, just to wrap up, essentially, patterns today, the way that they're written is kind of compensating for the fact that we don't have the same kind of knitting education that we had 100 years ago. 100 years ago, we expected knitters to naturally, not naturally, but to know how to do things because their mom taught them or their grandma taught them. And knitting was just a part of their, kind of everyday lives. And so they didn't have to have everything explained to them. And that's no longer the case. Um, While you personally might not need that level of detail in your patterns, someone out there does. So just because you don't need all of that extra information, maybe you don't need the tutorials, maybe you don't need to have the shaping explained to you, that doesn't mean there's not value in producing that information for the people who do need it. As someone who, as I said, pattern design was my job. Now it's just kind of a hobby. I release 4 or 5 patterns a year just for fun. I can tell you that people are actually advocating for more information to be included. It's not something designers just decided to do. Um, People are actively asking for that information. And when you are adding um, more details, more videos, more photos, more sizes, all of that takes more work and you should be compensated for it. Unfortunately, it is simply not feasible for designers to kind of create, you know, 4 different versions of a pattern for different skill sets and then have a sliding scale on the pattern price. Like, okay, the pattern for written for beginners costs $12, but the pattern written for experience costs 5. That's just impossible. And even if it were possible, I guarantee you people would purchase the cheapest pattern and then pester the designer with a million questions. That's just the nature of humans, unfortunately. So, does that mean there aren't people charging for badly written patterns? No, there's jerks in every industry. There are people selling shoddy products in every industry. Um, And it's obviously very frustrating to pay money for a pattern that is poorly written and full of errors. But I also think it's a mistake to kind of take from that the assumption that all patterns are therefore overpriced and not worth the money. Because there are some designers doing really good, clear, comprehensive patterns. Am I personally going to pay for a pattern for a garter stitch scarf? No, I don't need that. Most people probably don't need that. And I get that kind of at first glance, maybe it looks a little greedy. But the thing is, even though maybe most knitters don't need that, sometimes people are just looking for the security. They want somebody they trust to walk them through the process of knitting whatever the thing is, even if it's very basic. Nobody's forcing anybody to buy a garter stitch scarf pattern. But if people are willing to pay for it, there's a reason for it. And I don't think there's inherently a problem with that. As a designer, if I look at most patterns, yeah, I have enough experience that I could probably figure it out, but I still buy patterns because I don't want to. Sometimes I just want to sit down and have someone tell me what to do and come up with a beautiful sweater. And it's worth it to me to pay somebody to do the work for me so that I don't have to do it, that I don't have to do the math, and I don't have to do the thinking. Ultimately, you have to make the decision that is best for you and your budget, obviously. There are lots of free patterns out there. All of those patterns on the vintage knitting site are free. Oh, I don't know how those patterns would turn out. I'm tempted to give one a try just to see what I end up with. Um, and of course, there are lots of other sources of free patterns. So if you don't feel like something is worth it, you absolutely don't have to pay for it. There are other resources out there, but that doesn't mean that designers shouldn't charge a fair price for what they're creating and the work that they're doing, because it is a lot of work. All right, Last but not least, we have the winner of the big yarn giveaway. So in the video from 2 weeks ago, I shared that I have 17 balls of Knit Picks Yakish to give away, and the lucky winner is Debbie McKenzie. So Debbie, please go ahead and email me at this address and I will get your yarn out to you. Thank you to everybody who left a comment and played along. I hope we'll be able to do more of those kind of giveaways in the future. Thank you so much for joining me for this video. As I said, the blog posts that I referenced are linked down below, as are those the free vintage knitting patterns in case you want to check those out. If you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to give it a thumbs up, or if you maybe didn't like it, you can share in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe. New knitting videos here every Saturday. If you're looking for me on social media, you can find me on Instagram and Ravelry as Media Peruana, and I will see you soon in another video. Bye.